The Bob Murphy Show, episode 462.
There's a tidal wave coming. What you gonna do?
Get ready for another episode of The Bob Murphy Show, the podcast promoting free markets, free minds, and grateful souls. It's your source for commentary and interviews conducted by a Christian and economist. Now here's your host, Bob Murphy.
Hey everybody, welcome back to the Bob Murphy Show. I'm happy to have on Kyle Anzalone, who wears many hats in our circles. He's at antiwar.com and also at the Libertarian Institute, so he works closely with Scott Horton. And I have Kyle on where we first talk about the Venezuelan motorboat situation and how there's been a lot of U.S. strikes to combat alleged narco-terrorists, and how at least some of the guys in one of the strikes survived and the U.S. authorities didn't prosecute them as drug dealers or traffickers, but released them. And so that's interesting. So I asked Kyle for those details. And then while I had him, I just have him summarize what's going on around the world in terms of U.S. foreign policy, just because Kyle is hip deep in all this stuff. It's very informative. I think you'll enjoy it. Here we go, my discussion with Kyle Anzalone. Kyle, welcome to the Bob Murphy Show.
Thank you for having me. Honored to be here.
Oh, I appreciate that. Well, I have you here just to kind of give us a summary of what the heck's going on with U.S. foreign policy around the world. But the thing I want to open with is this situation of, hey, there's all these guys in speedboats going 1,500 miles taking fentanyl in the United States, and the U.S. is just, we're just defending ourselves. So can you give us a little bit of the context of that and what the latest developments are?
Yeah, so of course, Trump came into office pledging to crack down on crimes, talking about drugs crossing the southern border of the United States and immigration problems. And this has really morphed into a war that he's waging in Latin America, now in the Caribbean and in the Eastern Pacific, where he claims that he's targeting drug boats of cartels that the State Department has put on the foreign terrorist organizations list. And so it seems to me this policy is really driven by his Secretary of State, Marco Rubio. Of course, he's a South Florida Republican and really kind of sticks with the ideology you would expect. He's a real hawk when it comes to Latin America. He wants regime change in Cuba and Venezuela, first and foremost, maybe even putting Colombia on that list. And so it seems that Trump has authorized, and this is public, has authorized the Department of War to conduct lethal strikes against any members of these narco-terrorist cartels, as they call them. Secretary of War Pete Hegseth has compared the narco-terrorists to Al-Qaeda, and it seems that they're waging the kind of drone war that we've seen for years and years and years in the Middle East that has killed any number of civilians. And here with these drug boats in Latin America, it's really unclear. The Pentagon doesn't even know who they're killing. And of the 3 survivors, 2 of them were returned to Ecuador and then released by the Ecuadorian government, finding they weren't engaged in wrongdoing. The wife, and the wife is somebody who's a drug smuggler, might say he's a fisherman, but the wife of one of the deceased men said that he was just a fisherman, had nothing to do with cartels or gangs or drug smuggling. So it seems like they're probably killing at least some number of innocent civilians with these strikes. So far, I think the tally is up to 16, 11 in the Caribbean, and 5 in the Eastern Pacific.
You're talking strikes on vessels?
Yes.
That's okay. Oh, wow. And so then the death count obviously is some multiple of that because there's typically more than one person on each one?
Yeah, it's certainly over 50. One of the boats had, I believe the Pentagon said 14 people on it, and all of those were killed. A lot of the subsequent boats have been carrying, at least by Pentagon claims and all the reporting I've read, far fewer people, which would make sense if they were drug boats. Right? If you're smuggling drugs, you're not going to put 11 people on that ship. That sounds like they were actually doing work, probably fisher work, and who knows what the people on the other boats are doing, but I have seen reports of up over 50 now.
Okay, and then if we could elaborate a bit on the survivor element, and that was the thing that really pushed me over the edge when what I'm getting at is the official story on the face of it. Let me just go through a little bit, Kyle, for the listeners who don't know these details. So originally, the first one, you see the video and things blowing up, and Trump puts out on Truth Social or whatever, we took them out. These narco terrorists were bringing fentanyl, and then, give the statistic about how many Americans died from fentanyl over the last 3 years or whatever. And, we're keeping America safe. Great. And so people were pointing out some problems with that narrative, such as, look at this boat. This obviously is not going from Venezuela to Miami, which is it's probably going somewhere local. And then even Marco Rubio, when the press first asked him about that initial strike, said that, oh yeah, it was going to Trinidad probably, or so, he was saying it was, and then later he changed his story, I think, once he realized, oh, Trump is saying it was coming to the United States. And then the other element being fentanyl, when people, you can go look up the DEA's own, reports over the years about the fentanyl problem, and they don't even list Venezuela. It's, China and other country, but it's not Venezuela. So that also too is just like, what are you talking about? So that was kind of where it started, and I was annoyed that people were just taking Trump's word for it, that, oh, don't trust us. These guys were all drug smugglers. But then with this one, it's like, okay, so some of them survive these assaults, they get into U.S. custody, and so, okay, if these guys are such dangerous narco terrorists that we can blow them up, you would think we would prosecute them once we had them, and then they just let them go back. So to me, that was the obvious sign that they knew, yeah, we don't actually have anything on these guys. And so it amazed me how much the MAGA people, that didn't faze them whatsoever. Hey, doesn't this show you guys that they're lying and that this isn't what this is about? But
yeah, absolutely. It's quite amazing, as you say, that the two survivors of the strikes in the Caribbean were returned to Ecuador. They weren't held by the United States, which was a major red flag, and then an even bigger one when the Ecuadorian government let them go. Last week, we blew up, I think, 4 ships in a single day in the Eastern Pacific, and there was one survivor in all those strikes. And the U.S. didn't even send a search and recovery team out to arrest or save that person. They let the Mexican government do it. And I haven't heard any updates on if that guy did end up surviving, and if he did, what the Mexican government is planning to do with him. But it is interesting that, again, we're not arresting and holding these people. And of course, the Coast Guard has long arrested and held suspected drug traffickers coming from Latin America. So it's not as if they're not equipped or don't know how to do this. This is something that they've done in the past.
Yeah, and also, too, I mean, in fairness, they didn't give him back to Venezuela because that would be extra crazy, right? Because they're saying that Maduro is the head of the cartels or whatever, is himself a drug smuggler. So why would you hand it back to him? But here it was Ecuador. So in fairness, that element of the story, I guess, per se, is not completely crazy. But I'm just bringing that up because, like you say, Kyle, I know I saw reports that the family members of some of these guys that got killed are saying, oh, no, they're just fishermen. But I can understand a MAGA person saying, oh, give me a break. For one thing, maybe the family member doesn't know. Most people don't just go around saying, hey, I'm a drug dealer. But also, of course, they're going to say that, right? Whereas, to me, again, just repeating myself, what was crystal clear evidence that U.S. authorities did not have enough to prosecute these guys was that they handed them back, to their home countries rather than holding them. If they're bringing fentanyl in the United States. Now, do you know, have they pivoted away from the emphasis on fentanyl, or are they still maintaining that?
Yeah, they're certain. I think in Trump's last post, he said the drugs that are killing Americans. He's certainly referring to fentanyl there. Maybe you could stretch it and say heroin, but the emphasis is really still on fentanyl. And as you point out, Venezuela has nothing to do with the fentanyl trade. Venezuela just isn't a major hub of drug trafficking. Almost all the drugs, I think 93% of the drugs that come into the United States from Latin and South America come up the Pacific, the western coastline, not up the Caribbean. And so only 7% of drugs are trafficked into the United States through the Caribbean. And the drugs that it's cocaine. And so, this is the cocaine that's keeping the Miami nightclubs open late. This isn't the drugs that are leaving, these zombie people on the streets of Philadelphia and Chicago and LA and are killing tens, if not hundreds of thousands of Americans every year. And, this isn't just me saying this. This is the United Nations findings. This was in the Atlantic in an article published by Nancy Youssef. The U.S. intelligence community and DEA have long said this. And so the facts are just that Venezuela isn't a major hub of drug trafficking, especially not towards the United States. And the reason is economics, right? Cocaine costs a lot more money in Europe and in Australia than it does in the United States. And so being on the Atlantic side of Central America, Venezuela has a much easier time of getting the drugs to a lot of these Latin America kind of island countries that a lot of them are still vassals of European countries. And so it's pretty easy to smuggle the drugs from there into Europe. So it just makes more economic sense for them not to bring the drugs to the United States, but to bring it to Trinidad, Tobago, or any of these other islands and then get it onto Europe from there.
Okay. Yes. Great. And again, I'll link folks that it's not that you have to go to antiwar.com or something to get your alternate news. This is all U.S. government stuff. If you just go look over the years, their reports on the fentanyl in particular, they have whole brochures or whatever booklets on this stuff. And literally, I did a Control F. Literally, the word Venezuela is not in the entire report. So let alone do they say that this is a major source, of where the scourge is afflicting Americans. So obviously, this raises the question. I think most of the listeners probably know what the answer is going to be, but can you flesh out? So why are they doing this? If the reason for these strikes is not because Trump can't get to sleep at night worrying about all the fentanyl coming on little speedboats from Venezuela, why are they taking out these boats?
Yeah, so I think Trump probably does think he's like helping save American lives. I think this is really a result of Marco Rubio, Susie Wiles, and most of the Trump inner circle, especially when it comes to foreign policy discussion at this point in time, are people from South Florida, Republicans who have long wanted regime change in Venezuela. And so they're starting with these strikes against alleged narco terrorists in the Caribbean that are running drugs, right? They're not going after the kingpins. But they claim that Venezuelan President Nicolas Maduro is not only the leader of our cartel, but he's actually the leader of two cartels that are designated by the State Department as foreign terrorist organizations. The State Department, this was actually under Joe Biden, it was the Justice Department that indicted Maduro on drug trafficking charges. And so they're using that as well to say we need to get Maduro. The State Department has a $50 million bounty on his head. So I think really this is all about Marco Rubio basically leveraging his neocon ideology, trying to fit it into a MAGA framework to sell it to Donald Trump. And that's why you're seeing all this emphasis on fentanyl and migrants coming to the United States from Venezuela, when neither of those things are true in high numbers. And to the extent, any kind of regime change in Venezuela would certainly exacerbate both of those problems, not resolve them. But Marco Rubio wants a right-wing leader in Venezuela, and so he's willing to do anything he can to get Maduro out of power. And so they're cooking up this whole pretext for war.
Okay. And then also, do you have any special insight in was the Nobel Peace Prize winner was like the Venezuelan dissident, right?
Yeah, Marina Machado. And she was actually banned from running in the most recent Venezuelan elections. And they had this guy, Amado Gonzalez, who effectively ran as her proxy in the most recent elections. But she was the winner of the Nobel Peace Prize, and she hung the Peace Prize around her neck and then started going on all these interviews, endorsing Trump's strikes against these alleged drug boats. Some of them seem to be carrying civilians, so killing innocent people. Senator Rand Paul, he's a Republican. He has called these killings extrajudicial killings. He said this is unconstitutional. It's a legal war, but she's advocating for that. She is agitating for all kinds of military intervention and sanctions against her country. And so really, she's just acting as a tool, of Marco Rubio and the Donald Trump administration to give them more propaganda for their regime change in Venezuela.
Yeah, and I think I was watching Glenn Greenwald's commentary on that, when she was announced as the winner. And I'm paraphrasing here, and obviously he knew more about the case than I do. But I think his take was something like, you can think she's courageous, standing up to
oppressive regime or whatever, and that's fine. But again, since she's on the record, basically calling on the U.S. and other, Western countries to intervene militarily to get rid of this, what she considers to be an oppressive regime. Say what you will about that, but that's not somebody who's, stressing peace and diplomacy. Like, that's a weird person to give the peace prize to someone who's calling for, military intervention in their own country. So that's kind of weird.
Absolutely, especially when she's calling for the same kind of military intervention that the U.S. did in Libya, Iraq, and Afghanistan. I mean, she's calling for the destruction of her home country. And I'm sure, a big part of it has to do with she sees a lot of dollar signs, right? Even if there's a lot of destabilization in Venezuela, a lot of the oil assets are offshore, and I'm sure they would have some ability to secure like the gold mines and things like that. And then, she could put her friends in power who will give her kickbacks and make sure that all that oil money, she's getting a big cut of it. And I'm sure a lot of Western companies, particularly oil companies in the United States, will see those same dollar signs and are going to be more than happy to work with her if she ever ends up in any kind of power position in Venezuela.
So just to remind people, and tell me, Kyle, I had this right, that it was Hugo Chavez was 99 to 2013, I think. And then Maduro, had been his vice president. Is that the term they have? And then took over. And so Maduro's been there since 2013.
Yeah, I think he's won 3 elections now. The most recent one was last year. That election was disputed. Now, the State Department and the Venezuelan opposition have relied on a report from the Carter Center. And this is like the chain of evidence. They say the Venezuelan opposition got a hold of the tally sheets of 4 out of 5 of every district in Venezuela. And the Carter Center took this information and they say, by these numbers, there's no way that Maduro won the most recent election. I think Maduro claims that he won the election by some slim margin. He got just over 50% of the vote. I'm very skeptical of the Carter Center report, mostly because of the chain of custody of the evidence, right? The tally sheets ultimately were in the hands of the Venezuelan opposition, and then they showed the Venezuelan opposition winning the election. There's plenty of reasons to be skeptical of Maduro. Maybe he rigged the election. And of course, Venezuela is a communist state, right? And so there's millions and millions of people in Venezuela who are very poor, who rely entirely on government handouts. And of course, that, we're opposed to that, but that is a position that would win you an election in a lot of cases. So it's very possible that Maduro just, kind of won the election outright through the system of control the Venezuelan government has.
Mm-hmm. So is it, I mean, you brought up the oil and things is it as simple as that in terms of why is the U.S. government on the verge? I mean, they've got warships, in the region, right? And let me break the question up. So number one, is it possible in your mind that the U.S. will invade officially, by the end of this year?
I guess invade, I would put a question mark next to. I feel fairly confident to say that they are going to end up conducting strikes against Maduro's government. Actually putting boots on the ground in Venezuela is very, very difficult. This is a country that has a mountain range along a lot of its coastline. It's partial rainforest, Amazon rainforest, is part Andes Mountains. So just geography wise, it would be very, very hard to invade Venezuela. Additionally, we talked about I was talking about the poor people of Venezuela before. A lot of these people have the government is willing to give them arms, and they have an 8 million member militia or potential militia that they could field along with hundreds of thousands of regular troops. And so it could be a real disaster if we try to go in boots on the ground in Venezuela. And just judging by Trump's past behavior, I think he's much more likely to at least start thinking he's going to go in with one major round of airstrikes that's either going to knock out or destabilize the Venezuelan government. I somewhat suspect right now that what the Trump administration is trying to do is they're either trying to scare Maduro into leaving Venezuela, which I think there's a very little chance of, or they're trying to scare the generals around Maduro into thinking the United States is going to invade, is going to carry out a major bombing campaign, and have them overthrow Maduro just out of a sense of desperation of wanting to save Venezuela. So I think there's something of a psychological operation going on here. The New York Times reported, I believe it was last month, that Trump had approved covert lethal CIA operations inside of Venezuela. Well, that wasn't a scoop. That wasn't some whistleblower talking to Seymour Hersh. That was an official leak from the Trump administration to the press. So the Trump administration wanted Maduro to know that we are conducting these operations. I think if they really wanted to assassinate him, they wouldn't have made them public. They've made mock bombing runs with B-52s from Louisiana to right off of Venezuela's coastline. And last week in the Miami Herald, they reported that the Trump administration had approved land strikes against military targets inside of Venezuela. Now, that could be true. It could also be the Miami Herald is definitely right-wing leaning. They approve of regime change in Latin America. And, of course, I'm sure they have a lot of sources in the Trump administration, given how many top-level Trump officials are from Venezuela, including Trump himself, that they might have planted that story there. Now, I don't think that psychological operation is going to work. I don't think it's going to drive Maduro from power, in which case Trump is going to be either put up with backing down or escalating, in which time I think he's going to escalate to direct strikes on what they will call cartel targets inside of Venezuela. It's important to note that there really are, and the U.S. intelligence community has said this, there are no direct ties between the Venezuelan government and either of their cartels listed as foreign terrorist organizations inside of Venezuela. One of the cartels, Cartel de los Soles, was actually at least propped up by the CIA in the 1990s, really against the Chavez regime, and since hasn't existed in Venezuela. It doesn't exist. They claim it's a loose network of criminals that Maduro heads. And again, the intelligence community has said that Maduro isn't the head of the cartel. The other cartel is TDA, Trans de Aruga. That was the one from the apartment complex in Colorado that people will remember. This cartel certainly does exist. It certainly is a criminal organization that has roots in the branches, affiliates in the United States, along with their main base in Venezuela. But the Venezuelan government doesn't control that cartel. Now, I will say a lot of states that are under heavy U.S. sanctions do end up having either loose connections with or overlooking the activities of illegal gangs. And I think there's multiple kind of reasons this is useful to the government. It allows some of the members of your government to get a little bit of extra bump when they look the other way and they take kickbacks from the gangs. But then it also gives you leverage over them. You could arrest them at any time because they're engaged in illegal criminal activity. And so it's a really good piece of blackmail for the government. Additionally, when countries are under a lot of sanctions like Venezuela is, these cartels are the ones that have established tracking routes. They're able to get things secretly in and out of the country. And so then they could kind of expand that operation from drugs to things that become more valuable that would be legal going into any other country. But because it's Venezuela, they're involved in the smuggling. So I'm sure that there are some very loose connections between some members of the Venezuelan government and TDA. It just certainly doesn't amount to Maduro giving directions to that organization or anything like that.
Yeah, the first thing that came to my mind when you were talking about that angle about if there's a government that's has a lot of sanctions on it, why might they turn to organized crime? I was thinking just like currency flows. Like, like you're thinking like Putin's regime, like if they have to get money in and out and they can't use the banks or whatever. Well, geez, I know some organizations that are really good at moving money around, even though it's all illegal. So that could be a thing too. Okay, so I guess, not to dwell on this too long here, but what is the, like if they say, they want regime change, is it like, is there some other fact? I mean, I guess we just talked about how they gave that lady the Nobel Peace Prize. Like, is there a group of people that are that Maduro's fighting for his life, like politically, domestically, and so that could be that would tip the balance. And like you said, not so much that his troops would turn against him because they don't like him per se, but if they just decide, for whatever reason, it's not fair, but the U.S. doesn't like this guy and they're not going to leave us alone, and let's just get this over with.
Yeah, I mean, nothing that actually appears to be happening on the ground in Venezuela. I mean, Maduro doesn't, to me, seem to be a very effective leader. And of course, this is a very centralized state. And, in part because of the U.S. sanctions, but also in part because of the Venezuelan ineptitude of the government, right? The people there are very and unnecessarily poor. There's a lot of natural resources in that country. An important thing to mention, too, is that Trump even said Maduro offered to do business on all the natural resources, the gold, the oil, the minerals, everything that Venezuela has. They're willing to sell to the United States to allow U.S. businesses to come in, set up shop, extract them, of course, give the Venezuelan government a cut, and then export to the United States. So, I think that's like an important piece of all of this to mention. But I'm sorry, I kind of lost your question there. What am I trying to answer?
I guess I was like, I can understand what in other places like Syria or whatever, where, there is this domestic strife that's already there and there's factions battling for the control of the government, and then how the CIA and whatever can kind of come in and put their thumb on the scale. But so that's kind of what I was asking, is that like, how fragile is Maduro's regime even without the U.S. and we just kind of go in there and tip them over? Or is it like, no, without a full scale invasion, there's no way this is going to happen?
Right. So anyways, I guess, maybe it is a country that is ripe for an uprising at some point in time, but history of Maduro's rule in Venezuela and Chavez as well shows attempt after attempt after attempt by the United States and the CIA to overthrow the Chavismo movement in Venezuela has just absolutely fell flat. In 2002, they tried a coup. That didn't work out. Trump tried a couple during his administration. They had Juan Guaido declare himself president of Venezuela. And Maduro actually allowed, this guy was so unpopular in Venezuela that Maduro didn't even bother arresting him, right? Because the United States deemed this very unpopular figure as the leader of the opposition, Maduro just let him lead the opposition because he was so corrupt and so ineffective. And he tried multiple times to get the military to trade sides, and they absolutely refused to do so. It wasn't until he really fell out of favor with the Venezuelan opposition, he then fled Venezuela and ended up as a grad student in Miami. I think that was around late 2019 or 2020 that he did that. So Guaido was actually very effective ultimately for Maduro. Trump also tried to overthrow Maduro in what was known as the Bay of Piglets. They hired this Canadian named Juan Goudreau. He was recently interviewed by Max Blumenthal. Very, very fascinating interview. And they thought that they had bribed a significant number of high-level Venezuelan generals to defect, and they were going to land just a small number of special operation forces in Venezuela, and those special operation forces would essentially just protect the generals and make sure they didn't die, and then the generals would defect, and they would become controlling of the Venezuelan government. Venezuela knew about it the entire time. The generals, as soon as they got their beds of cash from the Americans, were going to Maduro and telling him that this was going on. And so, of course, they easily foiled this plot. And there was another one that recently came to light, that the CIA had approached Maduro's pilot and basically offered him, I'm sure, 7 figures or so cash if he would just land Maduro's plane in a country that would arrest Maduro. So they've tried many, many times, and it just hasn't worked out. So he seems to be fairly popular among the poor of Venezuela. Again, they rely on the Venezuelan government, but that doesn't mean that they're going to turn on Maduro. The last time Guaido declared himself president, far more people went out for Maduro than for Guaido. So Maduro seems fairly popular. His generals seem firmly under his control. So I see no reason to think that his government is shaky or about to fall.
Folks, let's take a break from the action for this word from one of our sponsors. Gold prices are now at an all-time high, but price appreciation isn't the only way to profit. You can earn a yield on gold, paid in gold, without selling your metal. Unlike dollar yields that can be slashed or even go negative, a yield on gold paid in gold means you're earning more ounces in your account every month. Monetary Metals allows you to earn up to 4% on your metal in their gold leasing program, and you start earning that yield immediately upon funding your account. The yield you earn is paid in ounces of physical gold, which you get in addition to any price appreciation on gold that might occur during the year. Now you can step outside the dollar system entirely and compound your wealth in an asset that's not a central bank liability. So the question's this: why earn in dollars when you can earn in gold? Join thousands of investors, and that includes me, I participate as well, who are earning a yield in physical gold annually with Monetary Metals. The link you want to go to is monetary-metals.com/Murphy to learn more. Once again, go to monetary-metals.com/Murphy to see how you can participate. Okay, let's get back to the show.
Okay, yeah, and some of your anecdotes there just buttress my own take on this, that yeah, there's oil and it's a socialist regime, and and maybe even with offers of deals, I could imagine like big multinational corporations saying, no, you can't trust a regime like that we could go ahead and sign a thing and we could get our wells all set up and everything, and then 2 years later he might just renege on it and seize all our. So I get all that, but beyond that, it just seems like their existence and the defiance is embarrassing to the United States. It'd be like, if somebody's throwing eggs at cop cars and the cops are like, we can't let that happen. Like the public needs to know, we will not tolerate that. And what I'm thinking of specifically, I don't know if this was on your radar, but years ago when it was still Hugo Chavez, he went and spoke at the UN. I think it was when it was hosted in the United States, but I might be wrong about that. But definitely, he was going to the UN when he was the leader. And George W. Bush was at the time the U.S. president, and he went first and spoke, and then Chavez goes up. And then he's like looking at the ground and he says, "Oh, I can still smell the sulfur," like saying that was from, you know what I mean? And it was just, it was funny, and I could just see how like for people around the world, it'll be like, wow, that regime, they're standing up to the United States and they can't stop them. Like, this is amazing, So anyway, I just wonder how much of that is just the bad blood, and like the U.S. has not liked the Venezuelan government for decades at this point.
Yeah, I think that's a lot of it. There's not a lot of intelligent people. Our original thought in Washington, D.C. And it's important to understand that wars don't have to make sense. The Iraq War made no sense. Saddam Hussein, evil man, deserved to die. Had nothing at all whatsoever to do with 9/11. Wasn't making nuclear weapons or any weapons of mass destruction. And yet, Dick Cheney wanted that war. And, he's dead now. I guess that's good for the rest of us. But, he wanted
folks,
that war.
We're recording Kyle and I are recording the day that Mr. Cheney has gone on. So that's what he's referring to. And again, with also, there's obviously like the cover story, then the real reason and all that stuff. But okay, so so thank you for that summary. While I have you here, Kyle, what else do my listeners need to know? Because you're on top of all this stuff, or in terms of like global affairs, specifically as it relates to U.S. foreign policy.
Yeah, I guess the biggest thing, of course, is the situation in Israel, just in general, everything to do with Israel. I see like a major crack up right now happening on the American right over the Israel issue. Tucker's interview with Nick Fuentes threw jet fuel on the fire of the debate going on within the American right around the Israel issue. Of course, the situation on the ground is that there's a ceasefire in Gaza that Israel is violating every day. They've certainly slowed down the rate of killing in Gaza. I think before I recorded this, I read 240 Palestinians had died in Gaza over the first 3 weeks of the ceasefire. Most of them died on a single day. Israel killed over 100 Palestinians, including 46 children. This is where the Marjorie Taylor Greene tweet about it being war crimes, 46 children being killed being war crimes comes from. So it's a brutal situation. The ceasefire is loosely hanging on. The Trump administration.
Hey, Kyle, can I just ask you, what is the Israeli government's position on that? That, yeah, we're over there and, we abided by the ceasefire, but these guys are, shooting at us or bombs are going off? Like, what is their explanation for why they're doing that?
So there were two incidents that happened in Rafah where Israel claimed that they were attacked by Hamas. One of those was initially debunked by the Pentagon. They said that Hamas had set off an IED that blew up an Israeli bulldozer. The U.S. pretty quickly leaked to both Ryan Grimm and Kurt Mills, independent media on the right and the left, that they knew that an Israeli bulldozer had hit an unexploded munition as it was tearing down a Palestinian house. But Israel used that to bomb Gaza like 24 times over the next few hours. I believe it was about 10 days ago now, Israel claimed that a member of Hamas opened fire on Israeli troops in Rafah. I have no idea the truth to this at all. Well, it could have been a member of Hamas. It could have been a Palestinian who picked up a gun. It could not have happened at all. Hamas has said that they're not in contact with any of their fighters in Rafah. Largely, Rafah has been cleared of all Palestinians whatsoever. So it's really hard to say what happened there. But then Israel used that excuse to bomb Gaza, I think a couple dozen times, and that's the day they killed over 100 people. Now, they've also just been shooting with snipers, Palestinians. The ceasefire has what they call a yellow line. So they divided Gaza roughly in half and drew a line around the area that the Palestinians are allowed to be in. They called it the yellow line. Initially, the Palestinians in Gaza don't know exactly where the yellow line is. So people are trying to return to their homes, which they think is near the yellow line. Israel says they crossed it, so they carried out a couple airstrikes of people who allegedly crossed the yellow line. Other people who got too close were shot by Israeli snipers. And then there's been sporadic airstrikes, one a day, maybe two a day, against various targets in Gaza. They're saying it's members of Hamas that are preparing to attack Israel in violation of the ceasefire. No evidence for it. Who knows if it's true or not? I highly doubt it. Israel seems to be doing everything they can to get out of this ceasefire at this point in time. And Haaretz has said that Trump, Haaretz is an Israeli news outlet. They say that Trump has this new policy that's called BB sitting. BB is the nickname for Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. It's meant to sound like babysitting. So he's sending J.D. Vance, Marco Rubio, Pete Hegseth, the commander of CENTCOM, all in a secession to Israel, basically to be there and to make sure that Netanyahu doesn't go further than killing one or two Palestinians a day and completely destroying the ceasefire. They want to keep the killing at a low enough pace that they could claim the ceasefire is still on.
Yeah, is it your sense that Trump kind of put all his chips in on this? Like, I forget the exact wording, but I mean, it was not sort of a tepid, with hands, fingers crossed behind your back kind of thing. Like he really was taking full credit for, yep, this is, we got peace finally, and I'm the guy that did it and everything. Like it. In other words, if this ceasefire breaks down next week, that would be egg on Trump's face. Like it would make him look like he didn't know what he was doing and was incompetent or wasn't a deal maker. And so on the one hand, that was a signal like, oh, so maybe behind the scenes he really is serious in telling, the Israelis, you guys can't do this. But on the other hand, it looks like what you're saying. That's my take of the situation as well, that it looks like the Israeli, they couldn't just come out and just carpet bomb the place for 3 weeks straight after the ceasefire. Like that'd be too obvious. But it does seem like everything they're getting a chance to just kind of, provoke it. I forget the exact details, but Trump was furious with them at one point recently about that. Like he was like saying to know that's not, you guys are violating the ceasefire. You guys cut that out.
Yeah, so I think Trump really got upset with Netanyahu when he tried to assassinate the Hamas leadership as they were meeting in Qatar. This was at the beginning of September to discuss a ceasefire deal that was actually proposed by Donald Trump. Of course, Qatar is a major non-NATO U.S. ally. The Qataris do a lot of business, not just with the United States, but personally with Trump's family and top members of the Trump administration like Steve Witkoff. And a strike in the Qatari capital city really upset the Qataris. And so Trump had Netanyahu come to the White House. He made Netanyahu call the Qatari prime minister and apologize. The White House even put out a statement saying that happened. It's certainly something that they could have left behind the scenes, but I think Trump kind of wanted to embarrass Netanyahu. And then from there, he pushed Netanyahu to agree to this new ceasefire deal. And so I think that's what's going on, that Trump is a little bit fed up with Netanyahu right now. He was upset what they did in Qatar. He's kind of punishing them by making them accept this ceasefire. I just don't think Trump has the long-term wherewithal to really make Netanyahu stick to it. It's easy to keep sending high-level officials to Israel for a month, for 2 months, but, we're talking 6 months down the line, Netanyahu's going to get reckless. Also, Netanyahu's trial is a big factor in all this, and I think this is something that Donald Trump actually understands. When he went to Israel after the deal was signed, he called on the Israelis to pardon Benjamin Netanyahu, and I think he understands that Netanyahu isn't going to let this war end while his trial is ongoing, because the war is his excuse not to show up for the trial. Maybe this is just a coincidence, but the day of one of the alleged ceasefire violations, Netanyahu was scheduled to testify, and what do you know, he had to cut his testimony short because there was a major security issue he had to deal with.
Yeah, it kind of reminds me of when under the Bill Clinton administration, when there was like the cruise missile attack on some pharmaceutical plant that killed some people. Like they were claiming it was weapons or whatever, and that turned out it was like an aspirin factory or something. And one thing of that at the time, that was right when the Monica Lewinsky thing was heating up, and I wondered, did he partly just order that just to change the news cycle, like to get the Monica Lewinsky thing off the front page? Who knows what motivates these guys. And to your point too, like where it seems like the Israeli government, and yeah, there's different factions where it's not just Netanyahu, he's not a dictator, there's different people, and there's hawks and doves and whatnot. But is my understanding right that as J.D. Vance was over there, that their parliament voted to annex the West Bank? Like it was a symbolic vote, but after the Trump administration unequivocally said, no, they're not doing that?
Yeah, so the Trump administration presented it as a symbolic vote. I'm not so sure it was a symbolic vote. I think it really does represent the Knesset, represent the thinking of the Knesset, the Israeli legislature, and Israel is moving towards annexing the West Bank, at least de facto, if just not outright legally. And it's important to note that while J.D. Vance and President Donald Trump has said this isn't going to happen, the U.S. ambassador to Israel, Mike Huckabee, didn't oppose annexation when he was asked about it earlier in this administration. So yeah, when J.D. Vance is in Israel, he's on babysitting duty. The Israeli Knesset passed, I believe it was the first reading. So they have like a parliamentary system, I think is representative a little bit more after the British government, rather than like the House of Representatives just having one vote. They vote on it with a select number of members of the Knesset first, and then I think they do a second and then a final reading vote of the bill. So this was not just a symbolic vote, but an actual first step towards annexing the West Bank. Of course, they're moving on it already. Bezalel Smotrich, he's the Israeli finance minister. U.S. media likes to present him as a marginal figure, but he's not. He's effectively the governor of the West Bank at this point. He has a post in the defense ministry that gives him that right. And one of the things that they've done, I think this will be particularly offensive to libertarians, this single man now has the ability to invalidate anybody's property rights, no matter how much documentation they have, no matter how much proof that they could say that my family lived in this house, lived on this land for centuries. He could go in and completely invalidate their property rights, all their deed to their houses and things like that. And this is something that the Palestinians have actually put a lot of money and effort into in recent decades to really try to solidify their claim to the land and their homes, is to get all this documentation, all the legal work done properly to say, this is my home. My father owned it before me, his grandfather before him. We could show how it changed hands over the generations. This land wasn't stolen. You have no right to take it from me. So that's a part of it. But most importantly, Smotrich recently announced a settlement expansion in the West Bank. And these settlements are for Israelis only. Palestinians can't travel through these settlements without special permissions. And this will actually cut the West Bank in two. And when Smotrich announced this, he said it will bury the idea of a Palestinian state. And so maybe they don't go forward and officially, legally, like the Knesset passes, Netanyahu signs a declaration annexing the West Bank. but it's effectively getting annexed a little bit more every single day.
Okay, well, thanks for that clarification. So maybe it'd be an analog of like in the U.S. Congress where, some bill like gets voted and passes out of committee.
Right.
So that's not like the full official thing, but it's not the same thing as just saying a symbolic vote. Like it really is an official, like on the way to it becoming law, is what you're saying. And so you think it was like J.D. Vance et al. Trying to spin it and saying, oh yeah, they did this symbolic thing. I don't know what their deal is. Okay.
And can I add just one more point to all this? I think it's important to note that Israel not annexing the West Bank is one of the core conditions of the ceasefire and 20-point peace plan that President Donald Trump put forward for Gaza. And one of the reasons that this particular point is so important is it wasn't just that Hamas demanded it be in there, but the Arab states, the Qataris, the Emiratis, the Saudis, the Egyptians, the Jordanians, all also demanded that point be in there. So this is essentially the entire Arab side that's against this happening.
Yeah. Okay, so thanks for that. And I see how that all fits together. Can we very briefly get an update? Have you been are you tracking what's going on in Russia? Can you give us, is that like a ridiculous thing for me to spring on you with, 5 minutes left?
No, not at all. I will try to go through this quickly. I guess just like a quick update on the ground. Russia is slowly gaining territory. This has been going on, I would say, for 18 months. I've been kind of surprised that Russia hasn't more quickly advanced at any point in time. I'm not sure.
Can I ask you just on that? I was surprised by that too. Like I'm talking like since the initial invasion, why is it like that they encountered stiffer resistance than they expected, or is it more Putin like they don't want to take a bunch of territory and then have all the people hate their guts, and so they're trying to be, you know what I mean?
So I think the initial invasion was absolutely bungled by Russia. That Putin really expected that if he was able to force 10,000 troops within 100 miles of Kiev, that Zelensky would sign an agreement, basically agreed to implement the Minsk deals that were negotiated under Barack Obama, which is autonomy for the Donbass region. And he also wanted recognition of the Crimean Peninsula as Russian. And Zelensky was about to agree to this in April 2022 before Boris Johnson went to Kiev and talked him out of it. So I think Russia bungled the initial invasion. They didn't have the supply lines. They didn't have the military equipment needed. They had a lot of problems. Lieutenant Colonel Danny Davis has done a lot of good breakdowns on this if you want more, but the Russian military just wasn't very effective. A second point is I don't think Russia or anybody could have predicted how much support the West was going to give Ukraine. I mean, when they invaded in 2022, they said, we'll send you Javelin anti-tank missiles and Stinger anti-aircraft missiles. These are both shoulder fired, but we're not sending you Abrams tanks, Patriot missiles, F-16s, cruise missiles, long-range missiles, artillery. All those things have now gone to Ukraine. And so I think this has allowed the Ukrainians to fight on a lot longer than they
got
have.
F-16s?
Yes.
Jeez, that wasn't on my radar.
Yeah. I don't
intended.
think the pilots are not very well trained. And so they don't fly them anywhere near the front lines. And they don't actually engage in any combat operations like bombing Russian troops. They are there to help shoot down incoming Russian missiles and drones. Is what they're using them for at this point. And I think they've lost quite a few of them already, at least like 2 or 3 of the dozen that have been sent. And so I think about like 2.5 years ago, Russia kind of settled in on this strategy where they realized that they don't want to take a large chunk of Ukrainian territory. What they want to do is force Kiev to negotiate the deal that they want. And if you're taking territory, if you're going on offense, it's just inherently a lot more risky and costly. You're going to lose a lot more soldiers. You're going to lose a lot more military equipment fighting a war that way. And so Russia, I think, is just trying to grind down the Ukrainian defenses to the point where they could conduct lower risk offensive operations, because the point isn't to take territory, it's to cause a collapse of the Ukrainian military. So then Putin essentially gets to negotiate with Zelensky at the end of this war at the barrel of a gun. I think from the Russian perspective, I think this is like just kind of a cultural thing, but also Putin's strategy is speed isn't important. right? It's not like when you're in the U.S. where politicians have a 2-4 6-year clock to the next election. And so you need to make the policy be successful today. Putin is going to win the next election in Russia if he wants to continue to be president. So he doesn't need to win this war in 2, 3, or 4 years. He's trying to win this war at the lowest cost possible to Russia and still get what he wants in the end. So the Russian strategy, I think, is just to take territory slowly and wear down the Ukrainian defenses. That said, the Ukrainian military still hasn't collapsed. I mean, they've gotten $200-300 billion in weapons from the West. That certainly helps, but they've been able to constrict and come up with the manpower to keep plugging the holes in the front lines, and they haven't been stretched thin enough that they've had like a major catastrophe loss somewhere where they lose like hundreds and hundreds of square miles of territory in a single day or over a week or something like that, which I will say I've been a little bit surprised about. Looking down the road in the future, I think the biggest problem that Ukraine has is just on the numbers and on the financing. Zelensky has said that the war is going to cost Ukraine at least $120 billion in 2026. He says that Ukraine could come up with $60 billion. I think that's absolutely fictional. They can't do that. But he says he is saying that he needs the West to come up with $60 billion. NATO is saying that he's going to get 12 to 15 billion in weapons. So there's just a massive shortfall in the weaponry. And even if the financing and funding was unlimited, simply the production lines in the West aren't. Russia is producing so many weapons that they're selling weapons in the middle of this conflict. They're selling missiles, missile defense systems to other countries, where the United States is doing everything it can to get every ally possible to send every last munition they can to Ukraine. I mean, just to show the absurdity of this, we actually forced the Japanese to change their constitution to allow them to ship completed Patriot missiles that were produced in Japan to the United States, so the United States could then send some of our Patriot missiles to Ukraine. It's just, we've gone through absurd logistic steps to try to keep the Ukrainians armed. And at this point, the Western weapons are running thin and they're becoming less effective. I read an article recently that the Patriot missile interception rates, the Patriot missiles are the Western, probably the most advanced anti-air defense system, and certainly the most advanced one the Ukrainians have. They're only intercepting Russian ballistic missiles at a 6% rate at this point. So the Ukrainians are increasingly vulnerable to the Russian long-range ballistic missiles. And ultimately, that could be what changes the war when this winter comes up. They're not able to defend their critical infrastructure. They're not able to defend their power stations. And when everybody is cold and starving in Ukraine, Zelensky might be forced to negotiate at that point.
Last question. So thanks for all that. That's very comprehensive. I guess last question on that. Given that that's the long run end game, if things just continue in this pattern, is there a danger that they're going to say we need to do a Hail Mary and give some advanced weapons to Zelensky that allows him to strike deep into Russian territory? It's like, well, if we can really inflict some pain on the people living in Moscow or something, then maybe that'll get the Russian people to say this is kind of crazy.
Yeah. I mean, I do. So Donald Trump has cut the USA. Biden was every single week he was announcing a new $100 million, billion-dollar aid package to Ukraine. Donald Trump hasn't done that. He's sold weapons to Ukraine by having the Europeans buy them from Ukraine. At the same time, he has authorized the CIA to basically give the battle plans to the Ukrainians to be able to fly their drones around Russian air defenses to hit their refineries and military facilities, civilian targets very far from the front line. He's authorized U.S. intelligence going to Ukraine to fire long range. Right now, they're using the British Storm Shadow missiles. They have a range of about 260 miles to Ukraine. But up until recently, the White House was apparently in real discussions about sending Tomahawk missiles to Ukraine. These have a range of 1,500 miles. And if the Ukrainians become desperate, Zelensky's not willing to negotiate. And I think it's very possible Trump can kind of be talked into the narrative that you don't want to be the president that loses this war. So
Right.
he has to come up with something. And I think at this point, probably the only thing that could look, it's not going to change the outcome of the war, but the U.S. gives Ukraine missiles with a range of 1,500 miles, then Russia really has to redo how they have all their air defense systems in place. They have to change their supply lines and where they need extra support and things like. So it certainly would set back the Russian war effort. It would probably inflict some losses on the Russian side as they adapt to the Tomahawk missiles, or the Tomahawks could be completely ineffective. It is, I think it was in 2017, Donald Trump fired, I think 52 Tomahawk missiles into Syria, and Russian electronic warfare disabled, I think, like 4 out of 5 of those missiles. Only 8 or 9 ended up hitting their target. And so it could be that when the U.S. sends Ukraine the Tomahawks, and of course we'll send the oldest ones that are in our stockpile, that's what we've done with every other weapon system that we sent them, that the Russians already have these things beat and they could be completely ineffective at all. But I do worry that Trump is going to be put in a position where he's either told that he's going to lose or escalate, and he'll choose escalation, whether that comes in Tomahawk missiles or some other form of support for the Ukrainians.
Okay, well, deep stuff. Thank you, Kyle, and I'm impressed as always by your command of all the details on these numerous stories. People want to hear more, see your work, and understand how is it that you're on top of all this stuff. Where can they go to find your stuff?
Yeah, so the best place to just follow me for everything I do is my Twitter handle at @KyleAnslone_. If you do one thing, do that. I am the opinion editor of antiwar.com and the news editor at both the Libertarian Institute and JudgeNap.com. And I host 2 shows, Conflicts of Interest and the Kyle Anslone Show, which is an interview show that I do. Got great production value. Very happy with that. It's a newer project that I'm working on. So check that out if you can.
Okay, well, glad to hear that. Congratulations on that. So, again, Kyle, thanks for your time here and bringing us up to speed on everything going on.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thanks, everybody, for tuning in. See you next time.
You've just experienced another episode of The Bob Murphy Show, the podcast promoting free markets, free minds, and grateful souls. For more information and to subscribe to this podcast, visit bobmurphyshow.com.